So this semester we're starting off our lecture series talking about the endocrine system. So last semester in A&P 1 we finished with the nervous system, and so we're going to look at the comparison between the control that's gained by the nervous system versus the endocrine system. And it's these two systems that are going to act together in a very coordinated manner in order to sort of regulate all of the various systems in the body. The nervous system is going to release neurotransmitters, while the endocrine system is going to function by releasing hormones. So most hormones are going to then circulate through the blood and are going to bind to receptors called target cells, whereas neurotransmitters are also going to bind to these receptors on target cells. So there's some similarities between the two. So here we have just a handy little table for your studying convenience, comparing and contrasting the nervous and the endocrine systems. You can look at that on your own time. It's all in the slides. So, looking more in depth then at the endocrine glands, there are going to be two main types of glands in the body. We've got our exocrine glands and our endocrine glands. Exocrine glands are going to secrete their product into ducts. Right? So none of these products are going to be hormones. Our exocrine glands are going to include things like our sudoriferous glands, our sweat glands, the sebaceous glands, the oil glands that we have in our skin, as well as mucus glands and the digestive glands, as well as several others that are found throughout the body. The endocrine glands, on the other hand, are going to be the ones that are going to secrete hormones. And these are glands that do not have ducts. And instead what they do is they secrete their hormones directly into the interstitial fluid that surrounds them. So the hormones are going to then diffuse into the bloodstream through those capillaries and are then going to be carried to the target cells throughout the body. So our endocrine glands are going to include things like the pituitary, the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenal, and the pineal glands. Those are our endocrine glands. So taking a closer look at these endocrine glands, there are going to be certain organs and tissues. They're not going to technically be part of the endocrine system, but they're also going to secrete hormones. And this is going to be because they contain the secreting cells. So secreting cells can be found in lots of different places, including the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the pancreas, the ovaries, the testes, the kidneys, the stomach, the liver, the small intestines, the skin, the heart, the adipose tissue, and the placenta if you're growing a human, if you're pregnant. So there's lots of places that we can find these secreting cells. Excuse me. So moving forward then, let's look at the hormone activity and the impacts that these hormones are going to have on their target cells. So hormones, like we mentioned, are going to travel throughout the body, but they're only going to impact or affect target cells that possess a specific protein receptor for that hormone. So hormone A is only going to bind to a protein receptor for that specific hormone, for that hormone A. It's not going to bind to anything else. So receptors are going to be continually going to be broken down and resynthesized. These receptors may be downregulated in the presence of high concentrations of hormones. So if there's a lot of hormone present, we don't need an outrageous amount of signaling. We're going to downregulate the presence of those receptors so there are fewer of them. And then alternatively then, these receptors can be upregulated when there are low concentrations of the hormone. So if we're trying to get all of our values worth out of the hormones that are present, we're going to upregulate the presence of these receptors. So we've got lots of receptors, so we can really make full use of all of that hormone present. So taking a look then at the four main functions of hormones. For starters, hormones are going to be involved in regulating stuff. That's like their big thing. They're going to regulate everything from the chemical composition and the volume of the internal environment, i.e. that extracellular fluid. They're also going to be involved in regulating the metabolism and energy balance within the body, within the cell. They're going to be involved in regulating the contraction of smooth and cardiac muscle fibers, as well as regulating glandular secretions, and to some extent they're also involved in regulating immune system activities. So regulation, it's a big one. All right. Hormones are also going to be responsible for controlling growth and development, and they are going to also regulate the operation of the reproductive system, and last but not least, they are going to help or be involved in helping to establish our circadian rhythm, so our cycle of awake and asleep throughout the day. So moving forward, let's look at how these hormones get to where they're going. So we have a couple of different ways to do this. So most of the endocrine hormones are going to be called circulating hormones. This basically just means that they're going to pass from that secretory cell that makes them into the interstitial fluid, and are then going to enter into the bloodstream, where they can then be taken to whatever distant target cell they may be targeting. There are also then local hormones. These are hormones that don't circulate, and these are going to act on nearby cells in a manner called paracrine signaling. So those that are going to act on the same cells that secreted them are called autocrine. Right? So if you're released and you target a nearby cell, you're a paracrine type of hormone. And if you are released and you target your own cell that released you, you're an autocrine hormone. So, looking at hormone activity. So local hormones are usually going to be inactivated fairly quickly. It's the circulating hormones that are going to be able to kind of hang around in the blood for a little bit longer, and they're going to be able to exert their effect for a few minutes and sometimes even up to a few hours. So these are going to hang around a little bit longer. So in time, our circulating hormones are eventually going to become inactivated by the liver and are then going to get excreted by the kidneys, so they're going to just become waste. Hormones are going to either be lipid soluble or they can be water soluble. So our lipid soluble hormones are going to be things like steroid hormones, thyroid hormones, as well as a gas like nitric oxide. And then our water soluble hormones are going to be things like amino hormones, our peptide, and our protein hormones, as well as eicosanoid hormones. We're not going to get too much into those. So water soluble hormones are going to circulate freely in the plasma, and our lipid soluble hormones are going to circulate bound to these little transport proteins, because they aren't going to be able to freely dissolve in the water that's making up the blood plasma. So they need kind of they're like little hitchhikers. They need somebody to help them get to where they're going. All right, so starting with looking at different types of lipid soluble hormones. All right, we mentioned we've got our steroid hormones, our thyroid hormones, and the gas nitric oxide. So starting with steroid hormones, these are going to be derived from cholesterol, which you can see here, this little four-membered ring, right? And each steroid hormone is going to have a very unique function or role due to the presence of these different chemical groups that you can see that are going to be attached to various parts of our little four-ring core structure, right? And it's these small differences that are going to allow for a huge diversity in function. So we've got a lot of different ways that we can alter this base structure, this core structure, and it's going to allow for lots of different hormones and lots of different functions of these steroid type hormones. Next, we have two different thyroid hormones. These are T3 and T4, and these are going to be synthesized by attaching iodine to the amino acid tyrosine. Right? So the presence of two benzene rings within our T3 and T4 molecule, our benzene ring is, you can see these right here, they're purple in this instance. So the presence of these two benzene rings within our T3 or T4 molecule is going to make this molecule very lipid soluble. So it's going to be very excited to be able to dissolve in any kind of lipid. And you can see actually the reason we call them T3 and T4 is because T3 is triiodothyronine. Sorry, these are never easy to pronounce. Triiodothyronine. Sorry. Say that 5 times fast. And you can see it has 3 iodines. So this is T3. Okay, so we've got our we've got our tyrosine molecule with our 3 little iodines attached, so it's T3. T4 is going to have a 4th iodine attached to the structure. And then last but not least, for our lipid-soluble hormones, we've got the gas nitric oxide. And this is can be used as both a hormone as well as a neurotransmitter. And its synthesis is going to be catalyzed by an enzyme called nitric oxide synthase. So that's how we're going to produce this nitric oxide. We then have our various water-soluble hormones. We've got our amine hormones. These are going to be synthesized by a process called decarboxylation. This is basically going to be modifying certain amino acids. And they are going to be called amines because they're going to retain that little amino group that they have from their original amino acid structure. So we've got a couple of different kinds of amine hormones. We've got the catecholamines. This is going to include things like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. These are all going to be synthesized by modifying the amino acid tyrosine. Right? And then we have histamine. This is synthesized from the amino acid histidine. And this is done by synthesized by mast cells and platelets. And then our last but not least, for our amine hormones, we've got serotonin and melatonin, and these are going to be derived from tryptophan. So our next group of water-soluble hormones are going to be the peptide hormones and the protein hormones. These are going to be amino acid polymers. So examples of peptide hormones are going to be antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. We'll talk more about what those guys do a little bit later in this section. And these are going to be protein hormones that are going, and then also as far as the peptide hormones are concerned, our protein hormones are concerned, these are going to be things like human growth hormone and insulin. They're going to play a really important role in the body, which we will discuss in depth coming up. So then there are going to also be several of the protein hormones, such as thyroid stimulating hormones, and these are going to have attached carbohydrate groups and are therefore going to be considered as glycoprotein hormones because they've got that carbohydrate attached. And then last but not least, we have our eicosanoid hormones, and these are going to be derived from arachidonic acid, and this is going to be basically a 20-carbon fatty acid. Don't worry too much about the structures there. So we're going to have 2 main types of eicosanoids. We've got our prostaglandins and our leukotrienes. These eicosanoids are going to be very important local hormones, and they can sometimes act as circulating hormones as well. So here again we have a handy-dandy little table for your studying convenience. Obviously it's tiny here, but feel free to zoom in on your own slides. So let's look now at how these hormones are going to end up being transported in the blood, because of how they're going to get to where they're going. So obviously the process for this is going to be different between our water-soluble and our lipid-soluble hormones. So most of the water-soluble hormone molecules are going to circulate in the water of the blood plasma, and this is going to be in a free form. So they're not really attached to any other molecule. They're just doing their own thing. However, most of our lipid-soluble hormone molecules are going to need to be bound to some sort of transport protein to help them get where they're going. The transport proteins, which are going to be synthesized by the cells in the liver, are going to have 3 main functions. These are going to make lipid-soluble hormones temporarily water-soluble, therefore increasing their solubility in the blood. They're also going to slow the passage of small hormone molecules through the filtering mechanisms that we have in the kidney. And this is going to allow for the rate of hormone loss in the urine to be decreased. So it's going to help them hang around a little bit longer. And then finally, these transport proteins are also going to provide a ready reserve of hormones. So these are already going to be present in the bloodstream. So in general, anywhere from 0.1 to 10%, a very relatively small fraction of the molecules of a lipid-soluble hormone are not going to be bound to those transport proteins. These are going to be our free fraction, and this is going to be able to diffuse out of the capillary and are then going to bind to receptors and trigger some sort of response on that cell, or on that target cell. So as free hormone molecules leave the blood and bind to their receptors, our transport proteins are then going to release new hormone molecules to replenish that free fraction. So it's gonna kind of maintain this level of free fraction here of available hormones that can leave the capillaries and bind to receptors. So looking at the mechanisms for hormone action. So responses to the same hormone can vary quite a bit, actually, depending on the hormone itself, as well as the target cell that that hormone is binding to. So the responses can do a wide variety in things. They can cause the synthesis of a new molecule. They can lead to changing permeability of a cell membrane. They can also stimulate the transport of a substance into or out of the cell. Also, they can potentially alter the rate of some sort of metabolic action, or they can cause contraction of smooth and cardiac muscle. So, as usual, as you would expect, the mechanism of hormone action is going to be different for lipid-soluble versus water-soluble hormones because of these transport proteins. They're going to work a little bit differently. So, starting with our technical difficulties, my apologies. So our lipid-soluble hormones are going to bind to the receptors that are actually found within the target cell. They're not on the surface, like what we would see when we talk about our water-soluble hormones. There's a big difference there. So for our lipid-soluble hormones, a free lipid-soluble hormone molecule is going to diffuse from the blood through that interstitial tissue. So it's breaking free of its transport protein. It's diffusing through the blood vessel, the blood capillary, into that interstitial fluid, and then it's going to diffuse through the lipid bilayer of our plasma membrane, and it's going to enter into that cell, right, or enter into the target cell. So if the cell is in fact a target cell, then that hormone is going to bind to and activate receptors that are located within the cytosol or within the nucleus of that cell. So the activated receptor hormone complex then is going to alter gene expression. So we're going to increase the production of proteins based on that gene. So as the DNA is transcribed, new messenger RNA, mRNA, is going to form, and this is going to leave the nucleus and enter the cytosol. From there, it's going to direct the synthesis of our new protein. A lot of times these new proteins are enzymes or that are going to have some sort of function in the cell. And then that new protein then is going to alter the cell's activity, and this in turn is going to be how that lipid-soluble hormone is going to cause the response that's typical for that cell. So, yeah, so if that makes sense. Next we have the non-lipid soluble hormone proteins. So because amines, peptide, protein, and icosanoid hormones aren't going to be lipid soluble, they are water soluble, they aren't going to be able to just simply diffuse through that lipid bilayer of that plasma membrane. So they're not going to be able to just bind to any receptor on the inside of that target cell because they can't make it in. So instead, our water-soluble hormones are going to bind it to a receptor that's going to stick out of the target cell's surface. So it's kind of like wearing like a silly little hat, essentially. This is our surface marker, or a surface receptor. The receptor on this cell surface, target cell surface, is going to be an integral transmembrane protein that's in the plasma membrane. So when our water-soluble hormone binds to its receptor on the outer surface of that plasma membrane, this is going to be what's called a first messenger. Right? So our first messenger, i.e. in this case the hormone, is then going to cause the production of some kind of secondary messenger that's inside the cell itself. And this is where our specific hormone-stimulated response is actually going to take place. So one very common secondary messenger is going to be cyclic adenosine monophosphate. This is also called cyclic AMP or CAMP. So looking at the actual process here with our little image for the mechanism of hormone action for our water-soluble hormones. So it's going to all start where our water-soluble hormone is going to act as that primary messenger, our first messenger, and it's going to diffuse from the blood through the interstitial fluid, right? And it's going to bind to our little receptor, our cell surface receptor on that target cell's plasma membrane. So this hormone receptor complex, after these two join, they're going to form this complex. And this is going to activate a membrane protein that's called a G protein. And here it looks like a little kidney bean, a little G protein. These are very popular proteins. They're everywhere, and they do a lot, and they're very much involved in secondary signaling. So this activated G protein is then in turn going to activate our adenylyl cyclase. All right, so adenylyl cyclase is going to be to convert ATP into our cyclic AMP. All right, and this is going to be taking place in the cytosol of that target cell. So then our cyclic AMP is going to act as our secondary messenger, and this is going to activate one or more protein kinases. Right? And so a protein kinase is just very simply, it's an enzyme that's responsible for phosphorylating some other kind of protein. All right? And it's this addition of this phosphate group that's going to lead to an activation or a turning on of that protein, essentially. So the donor of our phosphate group is going to be ATP, and this is then going to be converted into ADP. All right? So it's basically going to lead to an activation of these proteins that are going to have some sort of impact on the cell. All right? So from there, our activated protein kinase is going to phosphorylate one or more of these cellular proteins. So this phosphorylation, like I said, is going to activate some of these proteins, and it's going to inactivate others. It's going to kind of like switching them on and off. And this is how we're going to cause that cellular response. So our phosphorylated proteins are then going to cause some sort of reaction that's going to produce some sort of physiological response. Different kinds of protein kinases are going to exist. There are bazillions of them, tons and tons of different protein kinases. And there are going to be different ones within different target cells, and often within different organelles of the same target cell. So there's lots of these different kinds of protein kinases. So there's lots of things that can happen. So because of this huge amount of variety that we have, one protein kinase might trigger glycogen synthesis, and a second protein kinase might result in the breakdown of triglycerides, where a third might promote protein synthesis. The options are, it feels like endless. There's a lot of different things that can happen. So after a very short little period, an enzyme called a phosphodiesterase is going to come in, and it's going to inactivate our cyclic AMP that we have back up at the top of our little chain of events here. All right. So with this inactivation of our cyclic AMP, the cell's response is going to be turned off unless a new hormone molecule continues to bind to the receptor on that plasma membrane. So the whole cycle is going to cease to be active unless another hormone molecule binds. So quite the process. Very cool though. So how a target cell is going to respond to any given hormone binding to it is going to be based on several different things. All right, for one, it's going to be based on the hormone's concentration in the blood, as well as the number of hormone receptors that are present on that target cell. It's also going to influences are going to be exerted by other hormones. This is called a permissive effect, where the presence of or absence of a hormone is going to impact how a second hormone works. So some hormones are going to work more effectively when a second hormone is present to assist them. This is a synergistic effect. They're working together. And then some hormones are going to have opposing forces. They're going to oppose the action of others. And this is called an antagonistic effect. So, looking then now at the control of hormone secretions. Right? These are going to typically be secreted in short little bursts whenever they're needed. And this is regulated by three main things. All right, first we have signals that are coming from the nervous system. Also chemical changes that are found in the blood, as well as other hormones can stimulate the secretion of these little short bursts of hormone secretion. So, as with so many things in the body, most of the hormone regulation is going to be controlled and achieved by a negative feedback loop. So there are really, most of the feedback loops that we talk about in the body or in this class are typically going to be negative feedback loops. But there are some that are positive. Childbirth is a big one. Now would be a great time, though, to review any sort of feedback loop information, whether it's positive or negative feedbacks, etc. You should review that and the difference between the two. That's in Chapter 1. So, looking at the negative feedback for the control of hormone secretion, you can kind of go through this one on your own. This one is talking about a specific stimulus, which in this case is glucocorticoid levels. But like we said, most of the control of hormone secretion is going to be controlled via some sort of negative feedback loop. So now that we've kind of discussed sort of the background information for the endocrine system, let's look at the actual organs that are going to make up the various parts of the endocrine system. Starting with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. These are going to work together in controlling the various other endocrine glands. These are the big master regulators of the endocrine system. These two different glands, or these two different organs, are going to be connected to each other via the infundibulum, which you can see here. And the cells that are in the hypothalamus are going to be responsible for synthesizing at least 9 different hormones. And then in the pituitary gland, this is going to secrete about 7. So there's a lot of hormones, a lot of options that are coming from the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands. So be prepared for that, because there's going to be a lot of hormones. So together, these hormones from our hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are going to play a very important role in the regulation of just about every aspect of growth, development, metabolism, homeostasis. So basically, most of the things that are involved in keeping you alive and upright are going to be controlled by hormones coming from the hypothalamus, or being regulated by the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So these are some big ones. They're important. So the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland is going to be the larger one, right? And this is going to make up 75% of the weight of our pituitary gland, and it's going to be responsible for secreting 7 of the 9 of those hormones that are coming from the pituitary gland. So this is a big one. The anterior lobe, or the anterior pituitary, is also sometimes called the adenohypophysis, and this is what you can see here. And histologically, these two parts of the pituitary gland are going to be very distinct. So we'll look at them under a microscope in the lab, and you can see they're very distinct looking. They're a big difference. So that's our anterior pituitary gland. Our posterior pituitary gland is also called the neurohypophysis, and this is going to be made up of neural tissue. And this is only going to release 2 of the hormones that are made by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is going to secrete, releasing and inhibiting hormones that are going to be responsible for controlling the release of hormones by the pituitary gland. So they're going to reach the pituitary gland via the hypophyseal portal system. This is basically how things are going to flow between the hypothalamus down to the pituitary glands. So there are going to be 5 major types of cells that are found in the anterior pituitary gland. All right. So we have our somatotrophs, our thyriotrophs, our gonadotrophs, our lactotrophs, and our corticotrophs. All right. These are going to secrete these 7 hormones of the pituitary gland, specifically the anterior pituitary. So our somatotrophs are going to secrete growth hormones, all right, also abbreviated GH. For some reason, people decided to also call them human growth hormones, as if there was some confusion from where they were coming from. If we were studying mouse growth hormones, this would be MGH instead of HGH. I don't know why we felt the need to elaborate, because we are obviously studying human anatomy and physiology. But alas. So, human growth hormone. This is an important one. This is being secreted by our somatotrophs. This is also called somatotropin. Right? Growth hormone is going to be responsible for stimulating the general body growth. This is how you grow taller when you're like a little kid, or other things. And this is also going to regulate several different aspects of metabolism. Right? Our second type of cell that we have in the anterior pituitary are the thyrotrophs. These are going to secrete the thyroid stimulating hormones. These are also known as thyrotropins. All right? Our thyroid stimulating hormones, our TSHs, are going to control the secretion and the other activities of the thyroid hormone gland, or of the thyroid gland, as the name implies. So there's a kind of a nice little naming system that got worked out there. Next, we have our gonadotropes, and as the name implies, these are going to be associated with the gonads. The gonadotropes are going to secrete 2 different gonadotropins. This is the follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, and the luteinizing hormone, LH. So both the FSH and the LH are going to both act on the gonads, either the testes or the ovaries, depending on your what you're working with there. So in men, these gonadotropins are going to stimulate the testes to produce sperm and to secrete testosterone. And in women, our gonadotropins are going to stimulate the ovaries to produce mature oocytes, or eggs, and it's also going to stimulate them to secrete estrogen and progesterone. So those are our gonadotropes. Next, we have our lactotrophs. These are going to secrete prolactin, and these are going to initiate milk production in the mammary glands. All right. So everybody has these, just at varying levels, obviously. So a woman who is not lactating is going to have low levels of prolactin that's being secreted by those lactotrophs. But men are also going to have lactotrophs. So they're also going to have that prolactin that, can be circulating. In fact, if you have like some drugs, a side effect of some drugs in men is to cause lactation, and it's because whatever that drug does, for some reason, stimulates these lactotrophs to start secreting prolactin. So it's really very interesting, rather odd side effect there. But anyhow, that prolactin is not just found in females. But anyhow, moving forward. Last but not least, we have our corticotropes. These are going to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormones, which is a long word to say, so we call it ACTH. This is also known as a corticotropin, and this is going to be important in stimulating the adrenal cortex to secrete glucocorticoids, things like cortisol. So some corticotropes are going to be remnants of the part of the brain that's going to also be important in secreting melanocyte-stimulating hormone. That's the other hormone that's secreted by our anterior pituitary, but we don't really talk about this melanocyte-stimulating hormone because scientists still really don't quite know what it does. So we don't really mention that one all too much. So here we have our list here of our 7 hormones of the anterior pituitary. We have mentioned and discussed 6 of them in depth, or well enough in depth, and then melanocyte stimulating hormone. Just know that that one exists, and we don't really know what it does super well. But it is important, potentially, maybe. We don't really know. So, next we need to discuss the hypophyseal portal system, how hormones are going to get from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary glands to stimulate the secretion of those two posterior pituitary hormones. So the hypothalamic hormones that are released, or that are going to release or inhibit our anterior pituitary hormones, are going to reach our anterior pituitary through the portal system. All right. Usually, blood is going to pass from the heart through the arteries, and then to a capillary, then to a vein, and it's going to go back to the heart, right? However, in our portal system, blood is going to flow from one capillary network into a portal vein, and is then going to flow into a second capillary network before it returns to that heart. So it's making like a secondary pit stop, essentially, so that it can deposit those hormones that are circulating. Right? And so the name of our portal system is typically going to indicate the location of our second capillary network. So in the hypophyseal portal system, blood is going to flow from capillaries in the hypothalamus into a portal vein that's going to carry blood to the capillaries of the anterior pituitary. All right, so this is kind of a weird one. So in other words, hormones are going to be carried by the system that are going to allow for communication between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and are going to establish a crucial link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So those are going to be very important in regulating all the various things in the body. All right. So going back then to the hypothalamus and our pituitary gland. So the release of anterior pituitary hormones is going to be regulated not only by the hypothalamus, but also, of course, like we mentioned, by a negative feedback loop. These are very popular in the body, these negative feedback loops. So the secretory activity of three types of anterior pituitary cells, our thyrotropes, our corticotropes, and our gonadotropes, are going to decrease when blood levels of their target gland hormones increase. Right? So, for example, when adrenocorticotropic hormone, HCTH, stimulates the cortex of the adrenal gland to secrete glucocorticoids. This is mainly cortisol. In turn, an elevated blood level of cortisol is going to decrease the secretion of both ACTH and corticotropin-releasing hormones. And it does this by suppressing the activity of our anterior pituitary corticotropes, as well as our hypothalamic neurosecretory cells. So in summary, the anterior pituitary gland is going to secrete 7 hormones. Right? We've got our human growth hormone, our thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, and then this last wonky one is melanocyte stimulating hormones. All right. So now looking at growth hormone. All right, we're going to go through and kind of look at these individually. All right, at the ones that are these things that are being secreted. So somatotropes that are in these somatotropes that are going to secrete these are going to be the most numerous cells that we have in the anterior pituitary, and as a result, the hormone, or the growth hormone, is going to be the most abundant of the anterior pituitary hormones. So we're going to have the most of this. Growth hormone is going to be responsible for promoting growth of the body's tissues. Right? This includes our bones and skeletal muscles. So anything in growing taller and getting like more swollen, bigger muscles and such. It's all going to be, a lot of that's going to be regulated by growth hormone. All right? And it's also going to regulate various aspects of metabolism, right? How we use energy expenditure in the body, essentially. So growth hormone is going to exert its growth-promoting effect, and it's going to do this in an indirect sort of manner. All right? It's going to work indirectly through a small protein hormone called an insulin-like growth factor. All right, these are IGFs, and then sometimes they're also called somatidins, but more commonly you see them called insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs. So, in response to growth hormone, cells in the liver, in the skeletal muscle, and the cartilage and in the bone are all going to secrete our IGFs, right? And then using this IGF as a mediator, growth hormone is therefore going to indirectly cause growth of bones and other bodily tissues. Also then through direct effects, growth hormone is going to help to regulate certain metabolic reactions that are going to take place in the body. So the specific function of IGFs and growth hormones is going to include things like increasing growth of bones and soft tissue, enhancing lipolysis, as well as increasing glucose uptake. So like we mentioned, human growth hormone is going to be the most plentiful of the anterior pituitary hormones. Like we said before, it's going to be released in little bursts every few hours by our somatotrophs, and their activity of our little somatotrophs is going to be controlled by two hypothalamic hormones. We've got our growth hormone releasing hormone and our growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And you can kind of guess from the names how these work, obviously. So, looking at how we regulate growth hormone secretion, right? As usual, we have a negative feedback loop, right? Always a negative feedback loop, it seems. So, several things can trigger growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH, right, to be secreted from the hypothalamus. This little box here in the pink or purple, whatever that color is, can walk you through some of the reasons why this would be secreted. All right, so from the hypothalamus, we've got our GHRH, right? Once that's secreted, it's going to enter into the hypophyseal portal system, and it's going to flow through to the anterior pituitary, where it's going to then stimulate our somatotrophs to secrete their growth hormone, right? Growth hormone can act directly on various types of cells to promote certain metabolic reactions. So in the liver, the bones, the skeletal muscle, and the cartilage, growth hormone is going to stimulate the synthesis of insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs. These IGFs are in turn going to promote the growth of things like bones, skeletal muscles, and other tissues. So our elevated levels of both growth hormone and IGFs are going to inhibit the release of GHRH from the hypothalamus. All right, this is going to result in a decrease in or an inhibition of the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. Makes sense, right? This is our negative feedback inhibition here. Then there are several different things like hypoglycemia, high blood levels of GH and IGF, that can then trigger or stimulate the secretion of growth hormone inhibiting hormones, or GHIH. Right, these are going to be released from the hypothalamus and are going to be secreted, are going to enter into the hypophyseal portal system, and are going to flow to the anterior pituitary once again, where they are then going to prevent or inhibit our somatotrophs from secreting our growth hormone. And they do this by interfering with the signaling pathway that's used by our GHRH, our growth hormone releasing hormone. So they're basically blocking off the stimulus that says, go, 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 release that growth hormone. So this is how we're going to negatively sort of impact or slow down the production or the release of our growth hormone. So here so we discussed growth hormone, and that one's a nice one to talk about because it's got kind of a lot going on. But here we have a nice little table that's going to summarize the main functions of the various hormones of the anterior pituitary. So definitely know the function, the principal actions for our anterior pituitary hormones. Don't worry overly much about our melanocyte stimulating hormone, because as it says here, that the exact role in humans we really don't know. But it may influence brain activity, so it might be doing something in the brain. And it might cause your skin to darken, but again, we have no idea. So these other 6, though, definitely be familiar with their main function or principal action for future reference. All right, here I have included references. They're not references, links, activity kind of links that are associated with Wiley Plus. Make sure you've logged into Wiley Plus and have that all set up, and then click on these little links, and they take you to sort of either an interactive, an interactive sort of thing, or sometimes they're like a little video that might be helpful in explaining some of these things, but just a useful resource if you're interested. So that is all that we have for our first lecture on the endocrine system. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to get in touch or ask after class, as always. So thanks so much, and see you next time.